Hello and welcome to Dateline London. It's been an unremittingly gloomy week. What President Obama suggested might be genocide in Iraq, the continuing conflict in Gaza and the West African health emergency caused by Ebola. My guests who will struggle to be cheerful in all this are John Fisher-Burns of the New York Times, Nabila Ramdani, who's a French-Algerian journalist, Sol Zadka of Arise TV and Alex Dean of Conservative Home. Good to see you. Iraq first, and a distinguished professor of Middle East Studies in London described the fighters of the Islamic State, formerly known as ISIS, as not so much Islamist as evilist, filled with hatred for anyone, Muslim, Christian or otherwise, who doesn't fit in with their extremist views of an Islamic caliphate. Is the United States and its allies like Britain inevitably going to have to deal with the IS threat, which is already causing a humanitarian catastrophe? Well, it's already dealing with it in a way, isn't it?
Well, this is the ultimate denouement of the American entry into the war in Afghanistan, followed by the purported reason for going in. One of them, going into Iraq, was to deny oxygen and operating space to Islamic militants, Al-Qaeda. And now we have a group which in many respects is more brutal than Al-Qaeda, which is controlling large parts of Syria and Iraq, and drawing the United States and the United Kingdom back into a conflict that we thought we had bid farewell. And my sense is that whilst the present conditions seem to argue overwhelmingly for the use of air power at least, the question has to be asked, where will it end? If we're going to do this in respect of the Yazidis, the Christian minority from Galabosh, and the Kurds, what are we going to do when the threat arrives at the gate of Baghdad?
And a government which the United States clearly has very little confidence in fact, very few people have any confidence in the
Well, we're going to be left in the
government.
ironic position of hoping, it seems to me, that the Iranians will step in and confront the Islamic State. It's a terrible mess, and of course raises again the question of how carefully did we consider the consequences of the invasion of Iraq in 2003?
Do you broadly agree with that, actually, that this has its roots in getting rid of Saddam? He hasn't got many friends, he was a terrible man, but this is the consequence of it, or not actually thinking through what would follow when you got rid of a dictator?
Well, yes, absolutely, and I think we can safely say that, you know, this kind of policy now undertaken by Obama, which seems to be quite an ethical form of policy undertaken by a Western power, and let's be honest, it contrasts sharply with many foreign policy disasters, of which there have been plenty in the past few years, and not least of all Iraq. So it's a matter of, you know, the United States going back and, you know, sorting out the mess they've effectively created. Remember, there was no ISIS before the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. But I think this American offensive action is hugely significant, not least of all because it's the first since they withdrew the ground troops in 2011, but also because we're once again watching America in its role as a superpower, as the world policeman, and the precision bombings that we've already seen on ISIS so far have proved to be quite successful, and they will continue. And meanwhile, we have this huge humanitarian crisis to help those Christian communities and the Yazidis in particular, and this is all designed to prevent a potential genocide. And let's be honest, there seems to be quite a lot of support for Obama in Congress and also in most countries for that.
But, I mean, if you take one step back from this, you could say that it's fundamentally incoherent. I mean, a year ago, the Obama administration, the British government, was talking about bombing Assad. Now, we're bombing the people who are trying to get rid of Assad. We have a president who made his entire career as a run for the presidency based on the fact he opposed the war in Iraq. Now, very reluctantly, it's obvious, he's being drawn into it. And as John rightly says, we can see no particular end. What's the way out? Once you start bombing for humanitarian reasons there, where else do you have to bomb?
And he's still reluctant to bomb. And don't be over-impressed by what he did yesterday. A few bombs getting rid of a silly artillery battery belonging to the ISIS does not going to do the trick. This man who sits in the White House thinking that he is the American president, oblivious to the fact that whether he likes it or not, he is the leader of the free world, somebody who his imagination does not stretch beyond Washington, D.C., could have solved the issue as early as January, when ISIS took over Fallujah and Ramadi, and instead he was reluctant to intervene.
But how could he have solved it then?
He could have solved it simply by bombing this specific position that ISIS took in January in Fallujah and Ramadi and the province on Anbar. He did not do that. Then ISIS took over 2 months ago the city of Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq. He did not do anything about it. Then ISIS, a month later, expelled the Christians from Mosul and the province on Nineveh. He did not do anything about it. 2 weeks ago, they expelled the Kurds. He did not do anything about it. Now that he is facing a genocide, because of the Yazidis are going to be obliterated by the ISIS, only now is doing something which also could be regarded as very, very unsatisfactory, too little, too late. It reminded me of Clinton bombing by 2 token bombshells the positions of Al-Qaeda in Sudan on the eve of Bin Laden's moving to Afghanistan, and by that he brought himself afterwards the 9/11 disaster. Obama is reluctant to do anything beyond what he wants to do, to stay away from troubles.
Well, I agree with a great deal of that, and it seems to me there are some parallels to be drawn with the former Yugoslavia as well as Sudan, because when the West sought to impose peace by air power, those on the ground in control of the situation, who were persecuting civilians and conducting ethnic cleansing or genocide, thought, we need to go faster. We need to get our persecution sped up to try and deal with this before the international community really commits. What's clear to me is this cannot be solved by air power. Neither you can't police a situation from 10,000 feet, nor can you meaningfully help individuals in a humanitarian...
It's clear to quite a few military people as well, actually.
Yeah. The case you cite of Bosnia, that's where I spent a good deal of time, was a case where air power did work. It was 3 years too late, but when the United States unleashed the United States navies and its F-18s over Bosnia, the Serb insurgency, if you want to call it that, in Bosnia collapsed very quickly, and they rushed to Dayton to get a peace agreement. Of course, the situation is somewhat different here, but I see a great irony, I think would be a polite word, in the shifting positions of those who condemned the United States for going into Iraq, when one of its reasons, let's not forget, beyond weapons of mass destruction, was to end the murderous tyranny of Saddam Hussein. And there were many people, many of them calling themselves liberals, who condemned Bush absolutely for that, and have been judged largely to be right as a result of the consequences. But many of those same people and those same editorialists are now arguing, where's the United States? Where's the leadership? Where's the bombing?
Because they have a responsibility for the mess that his predecessor left behind.
Well, as Colin Powell said, if you break it, you own it.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that's part of it. But I mean, just to go to the root of the problem, isn't the root of the problem that the exercise of so-called democracy in Iraq has been a total failure? What we have is a sectarian government and an incompetent sectarian government in Baghdad, which actually cannot possibly control the country. The country of Iraq has ceased to exist.
Yes, very much so. And we've had a very weak American government, doing nothing to encourage more inclusiveness in the al-Maliki's government. We've seen persecutions against different groups, and the Obama administration did nothing at all to support, a fairer government.
No,
and some people would argue that this latest action is actually designed to protect America's own interest, and indeed personnel.
Well, the president said that there are personnel there, but you could say that that's for also domestic political reasons.
I cannot tell you how many hours I spent in my time in Baghdad with American ambassadors, secretaries of state, generals, who came to sit at the table with Maliki and try and argue with him to broaden his government, because otherwise no amount of American military effort was going to save Iraq. There had to be a political reconciliation. He refused it. He went on refusing it. American troops left. he became even more sectarian in the way he
And they
governed.
kept propping him up all the time, despite the fact that he was also...
What was the
Perhaps
alternative?
there's no alternative.
Well, getting rid of him, and they were in a position to do that,
Yeah.
especially when they knew that he is an Iranian
But then a war
puppet.
for democracy, knocking off another, you know, I mean,
Well-
isn't it the exercise of so-called democracy has not been an exercise in democracy in Iraq? That's the fundamental flaw.
Yes, and that's why I think that the Americans should have used their influence in order to have an impact on the Iraqi domestic political arena and find a replacement from al-Maliki.
The only other potential source of stability, other than a government supported by external forces or can appeal internally sufficiently to really run the place, is investment. And that's collapsing too in the face of the current crisis. So the FT has been reporting this weekend that Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, they're pulling their non-essential personnel out. As soon as that kind of business, which is in an already broken country, as soon as that kind of business in what it can offer, oil and extractive industries, stops, then there's no real way to run it internally with a proper funding stream anyway. Now, so you've got both sides collapsing. The democracy collapses and any kind of business stability collapses. It's a recipe for disaster.
And we have a status quo ante, because the very least you'd have to say about the bombings yesterday is the United States, the United Kingdom are likely to have to reimpose a no-fly zone in effect, or to continue to police with air power northern Iraq, as they were doing right up until 2003.
With Saddam, yeah.
But I think the reason
killing
why
people from aircraft, are they? They're going to be doing it on the ground and in the little streets that they control.
No, but the reason, remember that the
the
no-fly zone through the 90s into the early part of this decade was designed to prevent Saddam moving his troops forward into cities like Erbil.
But I think the reason why there's...
the air power is intended to do right now.
I think the reason why there's support this time around for America intervening is because ISIS is so spectacularly cruel and so spectacularly wicked that even Al-Qaeda has disowned them, and they're literally tearing to pieces, you know, everybody who they perceive as an enemy.
But why do we
Which is most people.
Which is everybody.
Why do we
except
also overestimate their military strength? There are only about 7,500 people in Iraqi territory. They could be really very, very easily overcome. And we don't do it, thinking that even air power would not be sufficient in order to flush them out of all this.
But where's the Iraqi
The
army?
United States alone, it has a lot of responsibility in Iraq. I'd be the first to grant
And
that.
this is just
but
the
why
kind
the
of...
United States alone? Where are the European allies?
They don't want to do that. The British are just, you know, paying a lip service. They don't want to intervene militarily. They would be very happy to provide humanitarian aid. That's it.
Yeah.
It's left to the Americans to do the job.
Well, is
ISIS,
that
dare
right?
I say,
Is that
has
fair?
the... Yeah, ISIS, dare I say, has the Hollywood villains stamped all over them. And this is just a kind of simplistic presentation, policy presentation, you know, designed for mid-America, and that's fit perfectly into it. And that's why Obama is enjoying support at home.
Well, let's move on, because even the optimists in the Middle East never really talked about peace in Gaza, merely a ceasefire. But there were hopes that exhaustion on both sides might lead to the realization that no one can declare a military victory. When we are apparently just one rocket away from even more deaths, where are we now in this very complicated chess game between Israel and Palestinians? How do you see it, Saul?
Well, look, yesterday the hostilities were resumed. If you read the British media, you would think that both sides have decided to start shooting each other. But this was not the case. Hamas did not want to continue the talks in Cairo simply because 72 hours of a ceasefire was enough for them. They want achievements. Achievements meaning lifting the siege, opening a new seaport, and giving them tremendous concessions, rewarding them for what has happened. And I would not like to repeat all the cliches about where exactly Hamas positioned its missile launchers and tunnels. It's enough for me to say that when we talk about ISIS, Hamas is all the way ISIS, every inch of the way, from top to bottom. Except one point. ISIS established its caliphate, its Islamist jihadi province 2 months ago. Hamas has been doing it for 7 years. Hezbollah was doing it in South Lebanon even earlier than that. And Hamas, if you ask me, is not in the position of even dictating terms to the Egyptian. And the Israelis would be foolish to accept any kind of concessions following what happened. Remember, on the 18th of July, there was an Egyptian ceasefire on the table. Hamas rejected it under the pressure of Qatar, the new sponsors of terrorism in the Middle East. And what is happening now? Hamas refused even to consider the possibility of extending the humanitarian ceasefire. And I tell you, if you want to know Hamas, just read their charter. It's very well documented. It's not that they refuse to recognize Israel diplomatically like all the rest of the Arab world except 2 countries. It is the Hamas charter that does not want to recognize Israel as an entity in the Middle East, because for them the Middle East is a sacred land. The charter is littered with chilling reading referring to the Jews as the devil's worshippers like the Yazidis. And if you think that Hamas will budge, they would not do it, because if you remove the charter, this is the raison d'etre of Hamas. If they recognize Israel, there is no Hamas anymore. And that's why I think there is no future for any negotiation with Hamas, because, and this is my main point, the Palestinians proved that they could not be trusted with the territory. They had Gaza to themselves for 7 years, and they turned it into a base of terrorism. Hence the fear of the Israelis that something similar will happen in the West Bank.
Okay.
Well, I think Hamas is a terrorist group which has next to no military capability. And we've seen that all over again throughout the conflicts. In this latest round of violence, 3 Israeli civilians have been killed.
3,000 rockets.
Hold on. Nobody interrupted
3
you.
Israeli civilians have been killed, 2 died of shock. Now, nobody would condone the firing of obsolete rockets into Israel, but they need to be dealt with in the manner that reflects the actual danger that they represent. And they represent next to 0 danger to Israeli lives. Why? Because there's a very effective Iron Dome that's protecting the lives of Israelis, and that's a good thing. So what is at stake? It's the security of the Palestinian. That's very much what is at the heart of this matter. And the extraordinary false logic that's being deployed of Israelis trying to justify mass murder, more than 2,000 people, more than 400 children, more than 85% being
So you're saying it's
civilians.
disproportionate, completely disproportionate to the threat that is being posed?
Not only that, but we're hearing all sorts of false logic used by the Israelis to justify mass murder and indeed infanticide. And this ranges from the Palestinians killing themselves to ludicrous claims that Hamas have just carried out a 9/11 on Israel. In my recollection, 9/11 resulted in the deaths of thousands of innocent civilians, and that's exactly what Operation Protective Edge achieved in Palestine, and not the other way around.
Oh.
Do you know, I think we could usefully move beyond these sorts of arguments which we've been seeing at every discussion program on television in this country and
So offer a
the
solution.
West for the last... Yes, what I want to say is that I think one thing everybody could agree on is that the security of both Palestine, Gaza, and Israel is the desired end state with a 2-state solution. And it seems to me that Hamas has not been, has paid a very heavy price, but it has achieved something in all of this, which is to threaten the security of the state of Israel in the sense that the security of Israel depends not just on the flow of arms and finance and diplomatic backing from the West, but from public opinion. And I think it's unarguable that what we've seen on our television screens, we could debate the fairness of the media, but 2,000 people killed, civilians mostly, 415 or 420 children, has done enormous damage to Israel's standing in the world, and as a result will damage its security. Israel's security is in reaching agreements,
But it had no choice.
with its enemies, however difficult that might be.
I'll come back to with you, but that's a very important point, because Israel can clearly defend itself, but defense is not the same as national security. National security is a much wider issue about whether you can actually trust your neighbours, and in that sense, John may be right.
Well, the recent events have been bad for Israel in terms of its standing in the international community. That's unquestionable. But for the last generation, Israel has endured extensive criticism in the UN and other bodies and carried on regardless. Now, I'm a supporter of the State of Israel, but it is difficult to say to Israelis who've put up with criticism after criticism in the UN and just ignored it, that this time it's different and this time...
You think it's a watershed, in a sense?
I think it's potentially a watershed, but the difference between international opinion and what's happening in Israel now is that the Israeli generals and those in charge of security have been given the permission and the green light to go and deal with military threats as they see them. And they will carry on doing that until they are ordered and made to stop. That's their job. That's completely understandable. And I actually question the logic that you just, in the exchange you had with Nabila, about a proportionate response. What's the merit of a proportionate response? Should you do less than you can to stop a threat? Because you may have an Iron Dome, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
No, it works all the time.
Oh, it doesn't.
One person died of a Hamas rocket, that's a fact. 2 died of shock, that's a fact. Over 14 years, less than 30 Israelis died from Hamas rockets. That's a fact.
What are you expecting happens?
I would say,
more than 2,000 people, that's another fact.
The Israelis lost many soldiers. The Israelis lost the PR battle. The Israelis lost billions of pounds. The Israelis lost the lucrative summer tourist industry. Synagogues were targeted. Plenty of bodies decided to boycott Israel. And yet, even in hindsight, I would argue, Gavin, that Israel had no choice. And it would do the same.
But do you take his big point, though, which is, we've only got a minute or so left on this, but do you take the big point that John is making, which is that Israel also depends on a degree of goodwill in Western democracies, and that has severely been tested now.
And this is the sinister behind Hamas tactics.
Gavin.
And that's why Hamas lost its entire support in the Arab world, except
before you move on, the last point that was made was I'd like to make was related to your first point. The ceasefire ended and immediately Hamas started firing again. That's unarguable.
Just before.
Yeah, well, fine. But if Hamas put down its arms, there would be peace in that region. If Israel put down its arms, there would be a massacre of the Jews like nothing you've seen before. That's the difference in the conflict. Israel has not conducted itself well over the last few months, but that innate fundamental remains true.
Last word on this,
Let me
briefly,
repeat
Nabila.
this. The military capability of Hamas as next to zero. The security of Israel being threatened is an absolute myth. Let me add this absolutely fundamental point. The Palestinian people today is the only people on earth to be asked to guarantee the security of its occupier. Israel would have gained worldwide sympathy if it had decided to resolve this matter through the international community. It decided to send soldiers to be murdered and to murder civilian populations.
Let's move on, because we will undoubtedly return to this. So, just when you thought that the news around the world couldn't get any worse, the Ebola outbreak in West Africa is spreading, and the health emergency has also become a political emergency for developing countries whose public health systems cannot cope. What should those of us in the relatively rich world do to try to help? I mean, we're spectators at something which is another disaster, which we seem to have very little leverage about.
We must absolutely not be spectators. And the attitude of Médecins Sans Frontières and the Swiss guys who are acting at the moment in West Africa is vital. I'm no expert on it, but I've spent some time in Sierra Leone, a bit of time in West Africa. It is clear to me, beautiful country, great people though they are, their infrastructure was inadequate to start with. So without Ebola, the medical infrastructure in Sierra Leone simply wasn't good enough for their day-to-day needs. When something like Ebola strikes and your doctors are getting sick from something that has a very high fatality rate, you desperately need help from the international community. Unlike the first two thorny subjects we've been discussing on this programme, my firm view is that on this topic there is an unambiguous right answer, which is massive Western medical aid as soon as possible. And it's in our interests to do that, as well as in the interest of those on the ground.
When I've talked to health workers there, and some of the people, Médecins Sans Frontières and so on, they just lack basic equipment. It's not that they were looking for a miracle cure, which would be wonderful, but they just want test kits and quarantine equipment and a degree of public order, which they can't impose.
And Obama has a fantastic opportunity to deliver as the leader of the three. Albany had this African-American summit. But Gavin, traditionally we choose the third item on this program as a cheerful one. And
I didn't think it was possible this week,
the only thing you can come out with was Ebola. And I was thinking, there is something cheerful about Ebola. I thought, Ebola, what is it? A jihadi group? Are they competing with Boko Haram? No, it's a disease. And as such, unlike jihad, is curable.
It's curable.
I think it's an interesting question to be asked. It's unarguable that we should do whatever is within our power and our financial ability and the reach of our medical knowledge to deal with this. But so far, I think about 1,000 people, somewhat less, have died of Ebola in West Africa. Every day, every week that passes, many thousands of people across the underdeveloped world die of malaria, pneumonia, and other diseases. And the perhaps slightly cynical thought occurs to me that the reason why Ebola has caught everybody's attention is that everybody is scared that our airports aren't sufficiently secured and that Ebola may migrate into our
That's a legitimate fear. That's not just a myth. That's a legitimate fear genuinely to be concerned about. Because if a traveller comes from somewhere like West Africa with malaria, we are well accustomed to treating them and we're very good at it. Someone comes from West Africa with Ebola, A, the chances are still very high of their own death, and B, the chances are significant of contaminating others. It's a real threat.
Well, I think the priority of Western countries, and let's be perfectly honest, for the rich of the world, is to keep Ebola out. And we've seen, you know, how countries like Britain and indeed France have been monitoring flight coming from West Africa, and the overriding aim was to prevent the disease from getting over here. But there's also been, you know, countries in the EU and individual countries as well pledged money to for, you know, the countries blighted by the disease. But the number one priority was always to you know, to effectively train aircraft crew and airport staff to spot the victims of Ebola. And again, it's self-interest that's the dynamic, the prime dynamic behind, you know, in dealing with this horrific disease. But I do believe that we have a duty to make sure that the greatest medical minds and indeed research laboratories do everything they possibly can to show solidarity, international solidarity. And we talked about war a lot on this program as one of the, you know, as being a massive threat to international security. But plague or pestilence remains as much of a threat as it ever
30
was.
seconds left, John.
An idea that might unite the first part of our discussion today to the latter one is how much money has been spent by the West, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, in the wars of the last 10 years now.
More than in the Marshall Plan, according to some figures.
Certainly a trillion, possibly $2 trillion. Let's just imagine for a moment that if we had sought diplomatic solutions to these challenges and been able to spend even half of that money on combating illness in the third world, how much different the picture would now look.
Well, that's a happy thought to end, an optimistic note to end. That's it for Dateline London for this week. We hope to have better news next week. Do join us then. Goodbye.
The Scottish referendum.